representatives from our local embassies, as well as other officials from the continent. So when you do your welcome, you can acknowledge them.
All right, we'll do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Marty, please cue me. Mangwanani akanaka, mwana wabino, habari za asiburi, ekaro, bonjour, bon dia, dumelang, good morning. Welcome to all of you joining us from all corners of the continent via the Zoom platform or live streaming through YouTube and Facebook. Before we begin, as participants, you are reminded to please select your preferred language to listen to the proceedings of today. There is a language interpretation option at the bottom of your screen to those of you that are joining us via the Zoom platform. Please select your preferred language, either English, French, and Portuguese. Once you have done your choice, please mute the original audio. You are also reminded that you'll have an opportunity for the Q&A and to pose your questions and comments to the speakers. Please use the Q&A icon for those that are joining via Zoom. And for those that are on Facebook and YouTube, you are welcome to post your questions and comments in the comment section of YouTube and Facebook that you're joining us with. So please sit back, relax, grab your cups of coffee or tea and get ready for what promises to be a real masterclass on building a capable public service in Africa. Brought to you by the South African National School of Government with the full backing of the Ministry of Public Service and Administration of South Africa. We do have the privilege of hearing from the Honorable Minister Senzo Mchunu later on today. Until then, we'll be tackling the theme, embracing cultural diversity as a lever to strengthening institutions for a responsive and ethical public administration. That is indeed quite a mouthful, and that is why we have experts today in the field who will present their views on this subject. You will again have an opportunity to engage with them through your questions and comments throughout the session. You can even begin now for those of you that have already thought of your input in advance. My name is Lerato Mataboge. I am a Deputy Director General in the South African Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, where I have rendered 20 years of service. So today's topic is really personal to me as a Pan-African public servant, and I am excited and honored to be your facilitator this morning. Now, I would like to frame our conversation and remind everybody that the main driver of this conversation should be the achievement of the Pan-African vision. Let me remind you of what that vision is. That vision says we want to see an integrated, prosperous, peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens, and which is a dynamic force in the international arena. We further have aspirations as Africans to say we want a continent where the full potential of our citizens, women, men, boys and girls, are realized with freedom from fear, disease, and want. At the heart of achieving these aspirations, and of course, achieving the vision itself, is an effective, ethical, transformative, accountable, and innovative public service. Such a public service will drive the social compact that we need with private sector, with civil society, with the citizenry at large, and with global partners for Africa's own growth and development, the Africa Rising we talk about. Now, the questions can be asked, do we have such a public service? With 55 countries in Africa, can we speak of a public service in monolithic terms? How do we accommodate and embrace diversity? Being so many countries that are trying to build a system for one Africa vision. Are institutions robust enough? Are they agile? Are they responsive? Are they forward-looking? What about ethics? How do we shake off these shackles of real and perceived unethical conduct among our ranks as public servants? Joining me in tackling these and critical questions are Professor Eddie Maloka, who is the CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism, Professor Maloka has broad range of experience, including having advised a number of ministers and premiers in South Africa on political matters. We're also joined by Professor Priska Oluoch, who's a director in the Kenya School of Government, who is also quite knowledgeable in matters of ethics and matters of changing behaviors in organizations towards optimal and ethical behavior. I am therefore quite honored that we have them joining us. And without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Maloka, who will give us the opening presentation. Professor Priska, Dr. Priska will follow with the response. Professor Maloka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Madam Deputy Director General Lerato Matabuche. I want to thank you very much, and also to say that your family name has a special meaning for me. One of my primary school teachers was Mistress Matabuche when I was a young man back then in the 70s in Soweto. So I'm very, very happy that we have a Matabuche who's going to be steering the proceedings today. Thank you very much, my dear sister. And of course, I must also join you in recognizing our Honorable Minister, Minister Mchunu, Senzo Mchunu, who's not just the Minister of the Department of Public Service and Administration, but to us as the African Peer Review Mechanism, he is the chair of the Committee of Ministers who are responsible for African Peer Review Mechanism within their country. So we work very, very closely with him, and we are very honored to have by his presence. And my co-panelist, we were just during the preparations, we're debating what title she should have, because she deserves so many titles for her role in Africa. And of course, she's our dear Professor Priscilla Oluchu. And there were suggestions for other titles, so I leave that title to another day. And of course, I can't miss the opportunity to recognize the principal of the school, my dear friend, Busani. I worked with him some years ago when I was the advisor to the Deputy President, and I know how committed he is to our civil service. But he's also one of our best, very experienced. So I think it was the right decision for government to give him the responsibility to lead the school. And of course, all the distinguished attendees, Madam Chair, that you recognize in your opening. Thank you, all the excellencies and all the invitees. Thank you very much for inviting me and also associating me with this important event on this day. I want to start by saying to my brother Busani that you preside over a body that is equivalent to the equivalent of party schools that political parties establish all over the world to produce their own cadres. Here at home, the ruling party, in South Africa and other parties have their own political schools. But also in Europe, the socialist parties and the social democratic parties establish their own political schools. They have the camps, summer camps, and and so on. So it's a very important institution, the School of Government, not just in South Africa, all over our continent. And really, it's a big responsibility that you have been given by government. And this is indeed a great honor and a big responsibility. Excellencies, it gives me a great honor to join you today on such an important occasion for our governments and societies. The Public Service Day is one of the significant platforms and opportunities to assess how far we have advanced as a continent to boost efficient public service on our continent, and what challenges are imposed by various factors, including external shocks like COVID-19 and other factors we can discuss later. We are all touched by the passing of our elder, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda. His death put an end to an era that actually ended more than 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the wave after wave of democratization that swept through our continent in the early 1990s. One of these waves passed through Zambia and took Dr. Kaunda with it. Then he has been in power as president of Zambia for about 27 years. These leaders belonged to a generation of ideology with capital I, They had a vision for their respective countries and our continent, and a body of ideas holding this vision together. They could see their destination. They knew where they wanted to go. They thought they knew which path to follow, which road to take. We now know that some of the paths they chose were not in the direction of the destination they had in mind. It is this destination that I want to talk about today, and a different path I think we should attempt this time. Let's start with ideology. We are afraid to talk about it these days because we tend to associate it with dogma or indoctrination. Myself, I see ideology as a set of connected ideas intended to inspire, to inform action towards a political goal. To me, ideology is ideas that has, or the ideas that have a political agenda. But as you know, ideas do not exist outside the human mind. They are our creation. They are our attempt to make sense of a reality that exists independent of us. Some of them turn out to be correct, others claim to be scientific. But at the end of the day, they are just a human creation. We used to think that the world is flat, and then this was science. Almost all of us believe that there is a God, and we call this religion. We dig deep into the mines to find gold, just a piece of stone, and we give this piece of stone some value. That's the human mind for you. Some clever among us paint a few strokes on a piece of canvas, calls that art, and sells it to us for millions of rands. Chairperson, I put emphasis on the human mind because of the constitutive force it has in society, how it generates ideas that in turn recreate us and recreate our society. But these ideas are important. Without them, we will just be an intelligent robot. The generation of Dr. Kaunda understood this. They had ideas at the starting point of the journey they wanted to take to their desired direction. This is what we are missing today. We are trying to create states and a continent based less on ideology, but more on efficiency, on performance that we measure with graphs. In other words, we are a generation of technocratic states, the states of efficiency and performance. Successful states are built on ideology. European settlers who created the United States of America in the 18th century built these states on the ideology of exceptionalism, the land of the great, and the land where you can realize your dreams. In China, from the 1970s in particular, the ideas of Deng Xiaoping turned this country into what it is today, around the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I want to challenge you, Excellencies, to read the works of the leaders of the period of the Kaundas. The most prolific of them was, in my view, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. I also find the ideas of Julius Nyerere very engaging, and I want to encourage all of us to really go back to these works. We talk of Pan-Africanism, Madam Chair, you spoke about Pan-Africanism yourself, but this is mainly a movement to connect Africa horizontally across the continent and vertically with its diaspora. But this movement has to be held together by an ideology. The most popular ideology during the time of Dr. Kaunda was African socialism. This ideology was even applied to the public service, and the key element of it at the time was what used to be called Africanization. And today in South Africa, for people who are familiar with South Africa, the equivalent of this is what they call in South Africa transformation. And I want to take this opportunity, Madam Chair, to really beg your indulgence to cite a very long passage or excerpts from the classic of Kwame Nkrumah, Africa Must Unite, which was published in 1962. And it has an entire chapter on the public service. I want to do this in order to give you a sense of how these leaders, the generation of Kaundas and them, visualize the post-independence public service. And I quote, I'll just make a series of quotations, then I'll try to talk to them. I quote, "A new social structure does not automatically follow the attainment of political freedom. That, like the battle for independence, has to be fought for and won by an army of stalwarts as determined in purpose as those who wage the struggle for freedom. This second stage of the revolutionary process, when viewed soberly, appears, if anything, harder than the first." I think here Nkrumah was talking about, you know, that people who know Nkrumah, is associated with this popular phrase that seeking political independence and everything will follow. But you can see here, he saw that as the first phase, but he says the second phase, which is more difficult. This is really where you want to put your ideas in action. And then I quote again, the finest plans we could conceive of our country will never leave the blueprint stage unless we had first-class civil servants whose outlook was unquestionable, was attuned to our African aspirations and upon whose loyalty could depend unquestionably. The civil service, being the administrative arm of government, is the instrument for putting into effect the economic and social program of the government. It is through its machinery that the political platform of the party in power is given effective implementation. He goes on, he says, government and civil service are interrelated. Government determines policy, the body of civil servants carries it out. The finest programs will get bogged down if the civil servants who direct their practical execution are incompetent and without dedication. Our desired rate of development must not be impeded because we are obliged to carry white-collar government employees who will put in a standard stint of office hours and then forget all about the job, who will never put a foot wrong, but who will never have an original idea, who will think the task performed with the writing of a competent letter, who will be more concerned with status and prestige than with helping the public, whose fear of responsibility will always prompt the passing on a decision and action, who will model themselves on some humble umbrella-carrying civil servant of an established state rather than the pioneer worker of a new and developing country. He then goes on to say that security of employment is a fine principle and one which I endorse, but I do not think a civil servant in Ghana today has greater right to security than the fisherman, the cocoa grower, the driver, the port worker, the teacher, the road laborer or market woman. I'm averse to our civil servants being lodged into state apparatus like a nail without a head. Once you drive it in it, you cannot pull it out. Governments must retain the right of dismissal, and the civil servant must be made to realize he can be dismissed if he does not perform the job required of him. He must be grappling with his work all the time, thinking 24 hours a day how best he can serve his country by his performance for the ministry in which he works. The Ghanaian civil servant must be utterly devoted and dedicated to the ideal of reconstructing our country. He must show leadership. He must, like his minister, set an example to the people he serves. He must be a pioneer. And then he then on says that our best laid plans will go awry if they are not handled with the heart as well as the head. And then he talks about an institution that he established under independence. He says an institute of public administration has been established where postgraduate students take years diploma courses in the theory and practice of public administration. There is also special courses and seminars for senior civil servants, and research is being carried out to find techniques in public administration specifically appropriate for Africa. Degree courses in administration are being offered. The country needs expert civil servants aware of and integrated into the society around them and with interest directed particularly towards the problems of Africa. And then the final citation, which is actually towards the end of this chapter, it says, it will indeed be a boon to all the new African states if those of us who have enjoyed a somewhat longer period of independence were to make available some of our officials to form a kind of African civil service pool standing at the service of emerging African states and ready to serve the new Union of African States. I close quote. Chairperson, I don't want to sound like a pastor to be preaching from a Bible or to treat these words from Nkrumah as religious text. I just think that they are pertinent to the school, to us, and to our generation. Here Nkrumah is talking about an ideological civil service, a civil service with a cause, a civil service that is driven by both the heart and the brain. I should hasten to add here, and the hands, a civil service that is a doer. I see this cause as what we call in foreign policy, this cause is what I see, the equivalent in foreign policy is what we call national interest. That is the good things, the future we want and wish for our own country, in spite of our differences and conflicting interests. This cause is the purpose, or what the French call raison d'être, the being or ontology of things. In society, this political ontology, this cause, this purpose is the collective good, a society we want to create. This may be a classless society, the land of our dreams, or society without males. Excellencies, Nkrumah saw his school of government as a training center for this ideological civil service. An ideological civil service is not the same thing as a partisan civil service. The latter, with the partisan civil service, is party-driven, party-oriented. It is fixated on the agenda of its political party. Like the ideological civil service, it has a cause, but its cause is narrowly about what the party wants. The cause of the ideological civil service is, however, broader than that. It's about the country, the nation, the African continent, and a better world. Ideally, we'll want the party agenda to be aligned with the interest of the nation. We'll want party partisanship to be in congruence with the interest of the nation. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. Chairperson, this brings me then to two challenges facing our civil service today. One is at the country level. The second one is at the level of our continent. I'm familiar with both, having served in the South African government and also currently in my assignment in the African Union. These challenges are at the country level, what we call the political administrative interface. At the continental level, I want to talk briefly about the state sovereignty versus Pan-African continental integration imperatives. The political administrative interface is a reflection of the tension between the political partisanship and the national interest. We saw Nkrumah's opinion on this point when he says that a civil servant must show leadership. He must, like his minister, set an example to the people he serves. He must be a pioneer, close quote. There is an interpretation of this interface that seems to suggest that the role of a civil servant is just to push paper, that the politics of the state are the exclusive domain of the executive. In this notion, the civil service has no brain, it has no heart, but just the hands to carry out a political decision. Yet the public servant has the three elements together in one person: the heart, the brain, and the hands. He is not an intelligent robot walking about executing political decisions. Chairperson, I want to challenge our national governance schools to clarify this interface in a manner that will affirm the humanity of our civil service, that civil servants are human beings, not robots. They have the heart that drives them, the brain with ideas that inspire them, and their hands are on the deck to deliver for their people. The civil service has to be ideological. It must have a cause. Ideally, we'll want, as I said, the ideology of the nation to be in congruence with the partisanship of political parties. But this is not always the case. Therefore, an ideological civil service keeps the balance and manages instances where there is a conflict, a disjuncture between national interest and political partisanship. At the continental level, we who are in the international public service grapple on a daily basis with the tension between what member states want from our continent, for our continent, and the decisions and actions which reside with their sovereignty at state level. We made two mistakes. This is the mistakes which were made by the Kaunda generation. First, when we got our independence, we created multiple independent states, not a federation like European settlers did in the United States of America in the 18th century. With so many states, over 50 of them, each with its own sovereignty, the pace of integration inevitably becomes slow. The second mistake we made, Excellencies, we created the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, on the basis of a charter. And now later we created the African Union on the basis of the Constitutive Act. Both legal instruments enter into force through a mere ratification by a member state. This is good, but this has proven to be inadequate and less effective because it relies on political will at country level. There is another model for ratification and domesticating an international instrument, which I'm advocating for, Your Excellencies. This one, the three examples is the International Criminal Court statute. The WHO has what they call the International Health Regulations. And then under the disaster management regime, there is the Sendai framework. And the domestication of these international instruments is through a national legislation. So there's a distinction. The current regime in the AU of domestication of our base instrument, which is the Constitutive Act, is just you ratify, your parliament ratify, that's it. But it's up to you what you do next with that membership, with the commitments you made. But with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, you don't just ratify, but you pass national legislation to domesticate it. And then your international commitments now have legal force within your own country. That's why here in South Africa, you had to deal with the issue of the arrest warrant for President Bashir, and all of this was emanating from national legislation which was passed in compliance with the ICC international statute. We don't have such legal arrangements for African Union instruments, even for the CFTA. The CFTA is also a treaty. We do it simply through ratification. There is no requirement for national legislation. Therefore, states are to international civil servants what God was to Adam and Eve. They are our creators. They create us with and for a purpose. But like Adam and Eve, many states believe that once they've created us, the international public servants, we stray away, we eat the forbidden fruit. We turn away from our creators, start doing as we want. States try to crack the whip to hold us accountable through oversight. This is what explains the debate, as you know, in international organizations theory between what is called intergovernmentalism, where where civil servants are mainly advocates of certain decisions taken by member states and they also coordinate, and what is called also supranationalism, where international civil servants have executive authority. There is also a debate, as you know, on the so-called question of principal agent problem in international organization. In this theory, international civil servants are the agent and our member states are our principals. And the question is about what they need to do, the member states, to ensure that we, as international civil servants, do not become Adam and Eve and stray away from the mandate they give to us. But the international civil servants are ideological. I'm making this, African international civil servants are ideological. I'm making this argument. They cannot function without an ideology. They operate at the continental level and are fully conscious of the Africa we want. We try to push our member states towards their collective vision, towards the decisions of the destination of that the Nkrumahs and the Kaundas bequeath to us. We need the civil service at the country level to be our ally to also push. But they must also be ideological like us if this has to happen. They must have a cause, a purpose, and they must be driven by the political ontology of Pan-Africanism. I'm not against technocratism, excellencies. We need it. Nor am I against the idea of a competent and performing civil service. On the contrary, I'm a staunch believer in this attribute. But a driver needs more than just good driving skills, more than just good manners on the road. Every driver must know his destination and must be driven by it. And a much better driver even tries to innovate to think of a quicker route to his destination. I'm also not suggesting that civil servants should not obey their political principles. No. Equally so, I don't share a view that civil servants should not have politics. Their politics, however, should be non-partisan. As the APRM, Your Excellencies, we are ready to collaborate with the national schools of government, like the one that is hosting us today. Let us work together for the Africa we want. The public service is an important pillar of leadership and sound governance. The African peer review mechanism as Africa's homegrown organization for sharing best practice among AU member states has constantly emphasized the necessity of empowering and enhancing public service delivery at national level to cope with global and domestic changes and enhance the trust between African citizens and their governments. And then I want to hear the APRM just to say that we, as the APRM, do work on the public service directly. And I want to highlight 4 areas where we're doing some work on the public service. And then the 4.1 is the work that we do in SDG 16, Sustainable Development Goal 16. The second one is the APRM country reviews. The third one is our own work on the SEPA principles. You know the SEPA principles, the one is a committee of experts on public administration established the UN to support the SDG processes. It's currently being chaired by a South African former Minister of Public Administration, Dr. Geraldine Fraser. And then, of course, we also are doing the work on what we call state resilience. On the SDGs, under our expanded mandate to assist African countries in monitoring Agenda 2063 and Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. APRM prioritizes SDG 16, which aims to build strong, efficient, and effective institutions and peaceful societies to enhance monitoring and evaluation of the two agendas. So far, we take note that our member states differ as regards progress towards implementing both agendas, particularly SDG 16, which speaks to essential aspects of public service delivery, including accountability, transparency, justice, and effectiveness. Therefore, this goal is seen as an enabler to achieve other goals. Pursuing SDG 16 is unquestionable to ensure countries' institutional preparedness and performance to leapfrog public servants' needs and challenges. At glance of the state of public service today in Africa, I just want to highlight quickly 5 issues. The first one is that African countries have some of the largest public service departments in the world. However, their delivery is uneven. Second, public employees in Africa are on average better educated than their counterparts in the private sector, but they are also twice as old on average than the population they serve. Job security remains the major motivation to sustain their work. Third, the average public service displays a lack of capacity across the continent. Political patronage and dependency are strong, while the best trained employees choose to work abroad. The brain drain issue is calculated among civil servants as much as it's among the best African businesses and, of course, the markets. Fourth, the strong interlinkage between governance and peace and security affirm that the stability and increase of interstate conflicts threaten public service delivery in various African countries. Building public service in transitional or post-conflict settings, often from scratch, represents a specific challenge. And currently, we deployed what you call a governance gap analysis to Sudan, which works with the authorities to assist the transitional government to re-establish, reconfigure, establish the institutional governance and legal elements required within that country, and we'll be replicating and taking this gap analysis tool to a number of countries through this in the course of this year. Fifthly and finally, despite the African Union efforts to apply gender parity policy of 50-50, women are still less represented or engaged in the African public service, especially in quite a number of our countries. As to coming then to the APRM country views. In the APRM, we work with the questionnaire, which is our base tool, and we use this questionnaire and administer it when countries prepare the reports on themselves. We train, we've got the technical teams, even within our own member states, the national structures, they know how to administer this questionnaire. The APRM-based tool, our questionnaire, gives considerable space to the public service and related issues. Of its 4 thematic areas, we have 4 thematic areas in the APRM-based tool, which is political governance, economic governance, socio-economic development, dealing with poverty, and corporate governance, the 4th one. So of these 4 thematic areas, 3 address directly the issues relating to the public service. First, under political governance thematic area, this area touches on procedures that are designed to ensure the continuous accountability of officials, elected as well as non-elected, to the public. The questions that are included on this issue seek to ensure that public office holders and civil servants are accountable, efficient, and effective. The indicators under this domain are meant to establish the quality of service delivery and ensure the accountability of public officials to citizens. Good public service delivery enables citizens to express their views on the performance of their government and to hold civil servants accountable for their actions. Constitutional democracy also requires empowering people at the grassroots level through the decentralization mechanism that allows local communities to participate in decision-making affecting their destiny. The second is the economic governance and the thematic area, and our base declaration that established the APRM, the Declaration on Democracy, Political and Economic Governance. In that declaration, African countries recognize what they said: good economic governance, including transparency in financial management, are all essential prerequisites for promoting economic growth and reducing poverty, close quote. In In this line, therefore, economic governance and management is to be understood as referring to the broad national economic policy framework, the institutions, processes, and practices in place that are aimed at facilitating, supporting, or otherwise promoting an economic climate that encourages growth, combating poverty, and promoting the general welfare of the citizens. And then the third thematic area is of corporate governance. And here in the APRM philosophy, corporate governance means leadership, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. The definition of corporate governance in Africa has evolved, and here we rely on King 3, has evolved from a system by which companies are directed and held to account to one that defines corporate governance as leadership, sustainability, and good corporate citizenship. Despite the use of the words corporate, more and more countries are applying corporate governance principles to all entities, regardless of the manner and form of establishment, and whether they are in the public, private, or the not-for-profit sector. We produce these reports, and we went through all the reports of the countries that we have reviewed, and a few issues come out there and relating to the public service. And I just want to highlight the dominant themes coming out of our findings. The first one, of course, is the dominant issue of corruption. It comes out almost in all reports relating to public office bearers, including the public service. The second one is, of course, the issue of merit in the recruitment in particular. The third one is the poor conditions of service, the remuneration, the poor remuneration of African public servants. And then the fourth one is the politicization of the public service. And finally, the legal framework, and in many cases, the absence of or gaps in the legal framework governing the public service establishment within countries on our continent. And then finally, Your Excellencies, on the issue of the SEPA principles, the principles developed by this committee of experts on the UN Committee of Experts on Public administration, under the AU-UN framework for the implementation and harmonizing of SDGs and Agenda 2063, the APRM has worked on raising awareness and, of course, helping build capacities among our national experts regarding SEPA principles for effective governance of the SDGs. The ECOSOC, as you know, which is the UN body, endorsed the 11 principles in 2018 to enable public service organs on SDG planning, delivery, and monitoring. The APRM recently conducted a baseline study on the state of awareness and implementation of the SEPA principles on the continent. And I don't want to go through all of them, but these principles, of course, they cover quite a number of things: sound policymaking, integrity, collaboration, transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, and so on. And some of the findings that come out of the study that we'll be launching quite soon is that first, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the central role of effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels that can cope with complex and urgent governance challenges. The second major finding is that raising awareness and knowledge of public servants on good governance and SDGs is necessary. This baseline study on SEPA principles has established that the level of awareness and knowledge of SEPA principle varies across the countries from country to country. And then the third one, of course, that our national experts admit that COVID-19 offers a silver line opportunity to develop certain strategies and principles like collaboration, bringing governments to the center of decision-making, investing in e-governance, and providing inclusive policies to empower youth and women to leave no one behind. Excellencies, based on these findings, the APRM will work with partners across the continent, particularly National Schools of Government, the Association of Public Administration and Management, which is APAM, which is based in Nairobi. And then we also, of course, with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the ACA, and the UN DESA, the SEPA committee, to provide capacity building programs and develop manuals on the application of SEPA principles at national level among AU member states. The application of these principles will guarantee a better understanding of essential strategies, including cultural responsive approach for sound public service delivery. The APRM, in partnership with the Pan-African University, is also we are also working on incorporating SDGs and SEPA principles learning among a new curriculum for African public servants and African scholars. Academic and executive postgraduate education program is being considered will consider SEPA principles to raise the awareness of essential public service principles pertinent to the code of conduct and ethics alongside cultural diversity. We are also at an advanced stage of setting up what we call the Africa Governance Campus, which will be open to public servants and also, but I think primarily to the African Union International Civil Servants. And then the other area is what I said is the state resilience, which is the APRM remains committed to support public service delivery and to work with our member states to help them prepare themselves for external shocks. One thing we established at the APRM is that when COVID-19 happened, none of our countries had predicted such an incident in their own planning. So even us in our own methodology, even at the level of the African Union, none of us had foreseen that such a thing will happen. And it means it's a weakness in our own processes, in our own methodology, lack of foresight, because we should have foreseen this kind of thing, because it's not for the first time that such an epidemic happened. So we have, to that effect now, as I said, we have 4 thematic groups, thematic areas. We are now, the presidents now of APRM have now approved the recommendation to establish a 5th thematic area, which will then focus on state resilience. So we are drawing on the work that is done at the UN level, even at the level of the African Union, on this DDR, disaster risk management of, that for member states to our issues of awareness, training, like for example, for countries that are, you have volcanic eruptions or tsunamis, there is ongoing awareness and training so that people are able to respond, like the fire drills. So we don't have those kind of things in our countries for people to be drilled and to be trained to respond to external shocks. The fiscal measures, of course, we should plan our finances in such a way that the states have enough reserves to be able to resolve. And then, of course, legislation, the Sendai framework provides basis for that. Legislation at the country level in South Africa, there is the National Disaster Act, which is used as a basis for response. So it emanates from this international commitments on disaster risk management. And then, of course, you have to create institutions. In the case of the National Disaster Act, it creates or establishes the national disaster agencies. But our own critique is that this international disaster management paradigm, it narrowly is understanding or conception of disaster is narrow. It focuses mainly on the natural disasters like floods and so on and so on and so on. And then it leaves the issues of pandemics to the WHO. The WHO, that's where it focuses on does the WHO so you find within countries, you have the health response, you also have the disaster risk management response. Sometimes it creates legislative or legal complications for countries. Here in South Africa, there was a debate whether the response should be based on the National Emergency Act or national disaster legislation, or we also have the legislation from health, which emanates from the WHO public health regulations. So, and this public health legislation we inherited even from the apartheid era. So this is what we are looking at in the work that we are doing. And then, of course, we are now conducting targeted reviews in countries to see the extent to which countries have these measures in place. We completed one last year on Sierra Leone, and then this year we'll be doing quite a number, and Kenya has already put in a request to have us deploy a targeted review team to look at what they call the big 4 agendas, and one of them is public health. Chairperson, as I conclude, let me reiterate our readiness to collaborate with the School of Government and bodies, and to say that as the APRM, we have national APRM structures through which we can collaborate at country level, in addition to the continental, which I represent in this event. Like in Kenya, we have the Kenya office, so the Kenya office could work with the Kenya National School. In South Africa, the there is a South African APRM entity and can work also with the South African National School of Governance. I've been talking, Excellencies, about what I call the triple significance of governance. That is governance as a bottleneck, governance as an enabler, and governance as a precondition. I believe in Africa, you get governance right, you will be 80% towards the African solution to African problems. But no governance can work or succeed without public servants being at the center, playing their role. But if our public servants are to be effective and impactful, they must have a purpose. They are not intelligent robots. They are humans. They have the heart, the brain, and the hands. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. What a tour de force. We're looking forward to the response by Dr. Priska Oluoch to what you've just stated. Let me remind all of us, and apologies for those that may have missed parts of the introduction that I made, as well as this wonderful presentation by Professor Maloka. Seemingly we speak very fast as South Africans, so I'd like to ask that the upcoming speakers please speak a little bit slower, because we have got simultaneous translation, French to Portuguese, English to Portuguese and English to French, that is happening at the same time as we are speaking. So thank you very much. Professor Oluoch, let's hear from you. Quite a mouthful, quite a strong presentation and a strong advocacy for governance and public service and the retention thereof to African solutions. What do you have to say to that?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Maloka, for taking us right up to the continental level, to the international plane, and really painting a very wonderful picture, particularly of the ideology of our founding fathers. And I think taking advantage in a positive way of the fact that it's so fresh in our minds that we have just lost one of those founding fathers. You are able to bring to the fore the founding fathers of Africa, having the mind of a destination for Africa, ideology versus indoctrination towards that political goal. And great states have always been developed on ideology, I think giving us some very good examples there. And also seeing therefore how we can connect Africa. And I think with the words of Nkrumah, again, I'm going very fast, ain't I? I'll slow down. The words of Nkrumah that you shared with us, connecting Africa vertically and horizontally. We are looking at how Africa there can be an ideological, how the public service can be an ideological space. And I think I would like to then pause a little bit as we connect to our topic on diversity in the public service and how that ideology of our founding fathers of one Africa with one goal as a people can still be realized, even though, yes, we were already divided into several countries, and therefore the start point was not the same. So diversity here brings the conversation around diversity here also brings us to the realization that, yes, we are one Africa, but we did not start at the same point. And we are also not identical in the sense that even siblings in a family will have their own personality, will have their own way that they want to grow. I love the analogy you have brought up several times that public servants are not robots. And those individuals that are not robots also speaks to the issue of diversity when we come to the individual countries and to the individual public servants all over the world. That the needs of the public servants is changing. And therefore, as we seek this single ideology for Africa or how to reconnect as Africans and public servants for that, then we need to look at some of the issues you have talked about in the light of search for diversity and how to manage this diversity for our public servants going forward. I loved what you talked about, the challenges of the public service today at the country level, that political interference, and we know we are all political beings, that is not going to go away. But how do we manage public servants as human beings in order to get more out of them. And I think this brings that ethical angle we were talking about. How do I want to live, and how do I want to live with others? Nobody is going to come to develop Africa for us. Nobody is going to be the driver, either economic, social, or cultural, of Africa for us. There has been a lot of hegemony telling us that, leave this aside, pick this, and so on. But we are waking up to the realization that Africa has great things to give, but even more, these individual human beings, the heart, the brain, the hands of Africa, the public servant, has a lot to give within that tension of countries, knowing that, yes, we want integration, but we are at different points. So how do we have this conversation knowing that the reality is our real situation is that we are at different points? How do we integrate? How do we diversify? I would want to hear more about that from the good professor. And then when we moved on to African countries have a large public service, I had wonderful things which are true, better educated, older than, and here again is that diversity. There is education, there is diversity in terms of education, even within the public service. Some are more educated than others, but we are saying that the African public servants are more educated than many other public servants out there, or in other countries, or in other dispensations. Job security, now we are looking at different generations. So yes, for the older generation, perhaps it was job security, but today it's not just about permanent and pensionable. COVID has brought that to us. Are we ready as public servants and as public services around the globe to embrace flexi time, to embrace different working arrangements, such as here I am in this conference and next to me are some school children swimming. That was inconceivable before, that a public servant can be having a serious or participating in a serious conference beside a swimming pool. But today it is possible. Political patronage is strong, especially when it comes to different things. But I also had a contradiction where we are talking about, yes, we are better educated, but then our competency is often questionable. Where is the problem? Could there be an issue about maybe diversity in terms of the methodologies we use to train our public servants, how we transfer knowledge in terms of technical competence, and also how we appreciate the diversity of the people we are working with, so that it's not a one size fits all. Gender parity, 50-50, that's the goal. We are very far from that. What are the reasons? What are the cultural holdbacks, so that we can then indeed talk about one Africa, diverse, but knowing that indeed in that diversity is our strength too. Thematic areas in terms of political, economic, corporate governance, and the new one, resilience. I think there was a lot there, but I just want to point what I picked from the dominant issues, which I think is something we can discuss further about based on the problematic areas or the issues. Issue of corruption. Well, is it always real or is it perceived? Because there are also cultural issues that sometimes revolve around matters corruption. How are we willing going forward to embrace some of our traditional ways of doing things, but also being very clear as to what is right, what is wrong? Yes, there can be the situational issue about corruption or about the perception of corruption. But on the other hand, public servants cannot be corrupt if the private sector is not corrupt, because there's the demand side, there's the supply side. So this conversation must also bring in the diversity of how government works. There could be the political influence, but I think there's also the private sector influence. Merit in recruitment, poor remuneration of public servants. Here in Kenya, many public servants have sometimes then creatively found a way of doing that by organizing workshops for themselves all over the places, because the salary may be low, but the allowances are available, and sometimes then give the possibility of expanding that. Absence of a legal framework in some places. So I think for me, excuse me, I would like to think also about focusing on the effective management of diversity at the workplace. How do we have this discussion thinking about diversity at the workplace, the need for qualifications, skills, and competencies of the workforce, and finding amicable ways of dealing with issues as they arise, which points to really Professor's contribution in terms of the human being is the one we are dealing with. How do we help this human being, that is the public servant, to rise up and to make an effort to embrace the other, starting with the other that is beside me today and the other that is in the next country and the following country. It involves drawing benefits from different people in their perspectives. The ultimate objective of managing these diversities is to create culture. Culture recognizes, respects, and encourages individual differences. Diversity as a conscious practice that involves understanding and appreciating interdependence of humanity, interdependence of cultures, and the natural environment without pitting one against the other as being superior and inferior. Because in that whole history, since independence and the dreams of our founding fathers, I think this is one of the things that killed part of the dream, because there was a lot of competition and then alignment to different countries based on other political ideologies, where sometimes some were perceived to be better, to be superior, to be more progressive. But how do we then, understanding that diversity includes not only ways of being, but also ways of knowing, ways of recognizing that personal, cultural, and institutionalized, that if we discriminate along those lines, at a personal level, at a cultural level, then we cannot really work with everybody. We will sustain privileges for some and create disadvantages for others. How do we build these alliances across our different public servants and also across our different countries? From what we've had, the AU is trying to do a lot of work anchored on the SDGs, but then workplace diversity refers to that variety of differences where different people in these organizations, these public servants, can begin to appreciate that we all bring different, we encompass different gifts. And the gifting, therefore, is what the public servant, if allowed to portray and to manifest their different gifting, will be able perhaps to be more free in order to express that better education, that I can, whether I'm older, whether I'm younger, since I'm better educated, there can be some innovation and creativity in how I work, even as a public servant. Job security, yes, for those who want to be permanent and pensionable, that's okay. But for those who prefer flexi time, that should also be okay, because we need to see a public service that is more dynamic. When we talk about the competencies, gender parity, what policies, what structures are we willing to put in place in order to make this a reality? And then going on to one of my final points, one of the tasks in managing diversity and also in bringing in that ethical component is to recognize that differences among individuals can not only be perceptive, but sometimes needs to also include some scientific intervention. I mean, how do people get to know themselves? And particularly our leaders. I want to focus on our leaders at this point, because I think the speaker also mentioned just how important it is for leadership and the whole area, the whole issue of corporate governance, leadership, accountability, and resilience, and so on. How aware are our leaders about who they are and the fact that they really do determine the course of this continent, the course of the organizations that they lead? How much feedback do our leaders actually get about how they are performing as they are performing? Because culturally, probably we've also always had, as Africans, I'm generalizing there, it may not apply across board, but that once a person is at a leadership position, we somehow let them be. You know, we don't tell them things. Yes, we may tell them when things are going well, and we praise them, but sometimes we don't correct them. There is little room for helping people to readjust so that they can indeed, in the course of their leadership, also realize that there are some things that I'm not so great at. There are some things that I could do better. Whose responsibility is that? Because accountability, yes, but how does it translate in real terms in the African context? I can leave it there for now and hand it back to Lorato. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Oluoch. Quite interesting and thought-provoking questions that you posed and giving us sort of a direction that leads us directly into our discussion with the participants. We are joined by quite a number of people in different platforms, in the Zoom platform, Facebook, as well as YouTube, and there's been some comments that are coming through. The participants would like to have you tease out, both yourself and Professor Maloka, tease out some of the key concerns that they have, as well as expand on some of the points that you have made. There's quite a lot that is coming out insofar as how we deal with corruption within the public service and the like. So if you will indulge me, I'll pose a few questions and I'll also raise some questions that had come up separately to you, so you can begin to have that engagement. Professor Maloka, thank you for your input. Please put on your video so that we can see you. You raised a key point, and I think it was your overarching and concluding comment to say that governance is the sine qua non for African solutions to African problems. And at the heart of that governance is an effective public service that is well supported, that has good conditions of service. Some may argue that indeed that's what we need, but the how is what is at issue. How do we support our public service better, our public servants better? And it was quite important, the point you made, that public servants should be seen as total and holistic human beings first, and not just titles necessarily. They've got brain, they've got heart, they've got the hands to work. It's the challenge is always in the how. We create such institutions, and understanding the differences in all our different countries. Again, one of the problems that we have, that is 55 of us talking about this. South Africa would have a different system to what Somalia would, to what Ghana would. So the how is still at the heart of this. So your thoughts on some of the steps that can be taken by the entire system, really, not just government necessarily. How do we get to do that? And for you, Professor Oluoch, I think one of the issues as well that has come up is, of course, the unevenness of access. And you touched on this as well, and I think both Prof. Maloka as well, of access to women and diversity that we need in terms of also representation, right? And in our case, it's not just women, it's people with disabilities, it's youth. But the issue then is that for a number of us, we've made headway in getting women in positions of influence and participation in the public service. The question is, how do we retain them? And we hardly have conversations about, once you've hit your 50% target of women, are the conditions conducive enough to retain those women and to actually leverage and to engage their talents for them to unleash them fully. I can tell you my stories as a 20-year-old public servant, having served 20 years as a woman, and what that has meant in terms of keeping going. But broadly, not just for South Africa, but broadly, even yourself in Kenya, I'm sure you've got experiences. How do we retain the women? So there's not just a numbers game. It's actually literally tapping into those particular skills. So our participants, you're welcome as well. Please use your comment section in YouTube and on Facebook, as well as the Zoom Q&A icon for your questions, but we'll start with those two for now. Prof. Maloka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, my sister, Mrs. Mataboke. And also let me also join you in appreciating the very well thought out and insightful observation made by our dear sister. I can see that you are in Mombasa. You are sitting there. You are on a. You are. I admire the background there. The restaurants there. You should place an order for me. So I'm really jealous. I'm sitting in Dakar, and here it's. I started my. You are 3 hours ahead of me, so you can imagine I'm half drowsy. So I mean, and you have a much better background. I'm sitting here in West Africa. And my sister, just to really agree with you with the issues that you raised, and I'm sure that later we can be able to come back to them. I don't want to disobey my chairperson, and just to try to respond to the question that she put before me for my consideration. The issue of the how do we move from point A to point B of the from where we are to where we want to be with respect to the civil service. I want to really give what could sound as an obvious answer, but perhaps that's where the difficulty lies. I think I was using the metaphor of the heart, the hands, and the brain. But I think that if to get things right with human beings, we have to start with the brain. You have to work on their perspectives. You have to work on their orientation, and then that then translates into the heart, and then of course the hands becomes the externalization of all these things that you have inculcated. And that's really the role of the school of government. And I don't know, I know in South Africa we have a very well-organized school of government, but I'm not sure how integrated all these are. Whether we have schools of government at national, at local, and then, so you sometimes wish that those who serve the public, they should be a standard induction, a standard development menu for all of them. That's how you get them to think alike. That's how you get your teachers, you get your nurses, because we don't have it. I don't know which country has it in Africa, but if you had an integrated architecture of preparation and orientation of our civil service, I think we could do quite a lot and inculcate in them certain ideas. Be fully conscious of the kind of civil servant you want to produce. When you are there, Madam Matabuche, you have been there for 20 years. Myself, I was an advisor in government for so many years. I have never been to any training by government. We come there as advisors, and I was in government as an advisor. At some point, I ended up being the dean of the advisors because I'd been there for long. People, when they get to the office, they will phone me, "Hey, Eddie, what do you do?" I say, "Me, this is what I do." So there is just the training of advisors in the South African public service. So the advisors are there. Their legal, you could say, their legal position is very tenuous. It's between this interface I was talking about, the administrative, the political interface. Some of them do well, some don't. And we get there, we don't know what to do, and there's no reference, there's no manual, there's nothing. And then the public, the so-called mainstream public servant, then they have all these manuals that they use, that they get, and so on. But I got a sense that we are not forming or creating an ideological force to drive the state to say this is where we want to go. And I think that's where it is missing. That's what really I was talking about, that it has to start with the preparation, the orientation, the integration, and the socialization of our public service. Once we have those things right, then the heart kicks in, and then the hands become the externalization. And I'll just give you an example of, in Europe, there was a wave of some social democratic parties that came into power after the Second World War. And then they established this civil service. They used to take them to training camps. They were so ideological that even when the region started shifting towards the right with the conservative parties coming into power in number, the civil service remained very social democratic in its orientation. So you look at the issues that are, for example, if you look at the debate in the US and in Europe. In Europe, public education, public health, public transport, these issues are not a question. They are taken for granted. These are the gains of the social democratic movement. This is what they created. And a lot of public goods, the freebies that they give, even the conservative parties in Europe provide these freebies. If they can try to take them away, they'll be in trouble with the electorate. By contrast, in the US, is the opposite. That people are socialized differently. that the state should not be giving you things, you should do things for yourself. There's a big debate on the public health system. It's something that will not take place in Europe. So this is really what I'm talking about. It depends on what you want to create, but you must start that with the mind, start in the heads of the people. It is in chess, when you play chess, they tell you, if you start attacking, you are going to lose the game. You must first spend half the time or half the time of the total time you are going to play developing your pieces, because getting your pieces into position in order for you to be able to win the game. So really for me, Madam Ntabuche, I'm sure that I've disappointed you, but if you were to ask me, I would say that we really need to create an architecture and look at the National School of Government as an architecture, an integrated architecture of all these different entities going down to local government, integrate the nurses, because the nurses are also being trained, the teachers are also being trained, but everybody is trained from a different hymn. They all sing from different hymns, they are trained differently. There is no central philosophy, there is no central ideology that is being inculcated in the people who serve our country. So then you are going to have a very disorganized, very uncoordinated approach to how people perform services. And the teaching has to be ideological. It should not be technocratic, because the technocratic element inevitably will be there, because you need a public servant must be able to operate a computer, must be able to read a budget sheet, must be able to. So those technocratic tools you need, but it should not be the one and only and the basis on which you train your power. It has to be ideological. What sort of a country you want, what sort of a people, what sort of, so it has to be in the training manuals of our teachers, of our nurses, of our public staff. Myself, if I'm getting South African government, I don't want to be singing praises about the Chinese, but the Chinese, I visited their training institute a couple of years now, in somewhere there in Beijing. When there are major policy changes, they summon everybody to the training institute. And you don't become a mayor, you don't become a councillor, you don't become a premier in the Chinese system without completing certain programs there. And they are primarily ideological. So the technocratic elements are there, you can't avoid them because you need them, but it's everybody. That's why the Chinese, when they started opening up and then we were visiting Beijing and meeting and going to different parts of the country meeting, they were doing almost exactly the same. They received you the same way, they say the same thing, they have answers, their answers to different questions, are the same. But you go to a lot of our countries, it's a little bit different, because we don't have a central training ideology, a preparatory architecture, and that's what I call. So this architecture, you have integration at the country level across different levels of, like in Kenya, you have the county. So the training of your officials at the counties must be the same as the training of the officials at the national level. And they must then, like if you go back to what Nkrumah was saying, they must then be a continental element to then know that this is what we are doing, but you are part of this continent. These are the continental issues, how you work with SADC, how you work with the African Union. These are the issues. So, but it has to be primarily ideological. It should not be a training that is technocratic. And my criticism here is that it's in my observation that our training for public servants tend to be largely technocratic, focusing on the tools, the hands, what you need to play the hands. They don't deal with the head and the heart. And that's really my challenge. You get that right, then the issues of ethics, the issues of, but of course, corruption, I believe that you don't just need to train a person better for a person not to be corrupt. You need measures within the state that are very harsh towards people who abuse state funds. So you need, I agree with you, my sister, private sector corruption, perceptions of corruption, but I think that the harshest punishment must be reserved for those who abuse state funds and state resources. So once you do that, then you discourage. But then in your own training, you must train these cadres who understand, who are committed, who see what they are doing as a mission, as a cause, and I think that you'll be able to address some. So that's for me. You ask, what's the starting point? How do you, the how part? I say start with the brain. Then once you get the brain, then the heart kicks in, and of course, the hands will externalize what is in the brain. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Priska, representation.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. And well, I'll just say one or two things about the other question, because I come from a school of government, the Kenya School of Government. And yes, we do have a lot of these technocratic courses as being described here. And I totally agree. We do have some courses that our public servants must go through. And there are certain levels at which the mainstream public servants cannot attain unless they go through certain courses at the Kenya School of Government. Nevertheless, there is definitely a crop there, especially where Professor comes from. That is the advisors. They resist coming to the school, or people who are moving from, say, the private sector to the public sector, sometimes have a superiority complex, thinking they know more. And therefore they say, well, if I have already gone through a management training or a supervisory course or a strategic leadership course, why do I need to come to the Kenya School of Government? And of course, the answer is always, government has different ways. And particularly what I love here, which I'm taking home, is the ideological. We need to, well, to be strong, indoctrinate our people, and we need to get indoctrinated in a positive sense in order to be able to sell the Agenda Africa. On to my question, we talked about the unevenness of access of women, youth, perhaps people with disability. So the first point is usually as, I was going to say as women, because, well, I fall in that category, we need to put ourselves forward for some of these positions for us to get in. But we need the supporting structures whereby the legislation that enables from recruitment to exit for people to get in. We spoke about once they're in, how do we keep them? How do we help them to stay? And to stay, we need to help to build, I would say particularly 3 C's, their confidence. Because sometimes once a minority person is there, they're still the minority. And organizations will usually mirror the characteristics of the majority of the leaders in many things. We may all be familiar with Sheryl Sandberg talking about how she got into a top management position. And when she went for one of her first meetings, she asked where the bathroom was. And the CEO of that organization did not know where the ladies' room was. It's like nobody had ever asked for it. They didn't even know physically where the ladies' room is. And sometimes it's things as basic as that in coming into that space, a person needs their confidence to be built so that they can continue having that support to be able to grow and to be able to bring that influence. Because, hey, just because you're in doesn't mean you're already part of the in group. You still have to find your way into the in group and the in group. Secondly, competency. We say that once we are there as women or as the youth or as minority, let's not take it for granted. Let's try to, yes, again, use our hearts, use our minds, and also use our femininity. Yes, let's build that competence. Let's have the knowledge. Let's not be blondes, as in our country we say, we don't want flower girls. Or, okay, fine, we can have a few flower girls in parliament. It's okay, they look nice. But we are not there to be flower girls in that sense. We are the bride. We are at the table on equal terms, but for that one has to be competent and be seen to be competent. And there are ways of demonstrating competence which stand out, because when you do your work and you do it well and you're able to ask, the right kind of questions, you're able to raise your voice. You don't necessarily have to whisper to your brother to say, I was also thinking this. Then he says it boomingly as though it was his idea. So we have to find ways, because there are also suppression techniques that men use to keep women down. And we know them, the 5 master suppression techniques that we can talk about, which then don't enable women. And for that, between the cultural barriers and so on, one has to grow in competence in order for them then to be more confident. And then the 3rd C I would talk about is courage. Have the courage to step forward, have the courage to say you don't know when you don't know, have the courage to actually be you. There are times when, as women in leadership, our male colleagues still expect certain feminine traits from us. They still expect you to serve them tea. That's okay. for heaven's sake, what's wrong with serving tea? Even if a man asks for it. It doesn't mean that I'm becoming less, but it's how we engage intellectually, even in that tea. Today, I might serve you tea. Tomorrow, you'll serve me tea. There's no problem. But it's in how we then become courageous enough to remain true to ourselves, but at the same time, courageous enough to know that I'm not there for myself. I think this is a point to your question. Why does it sometimes happen that women will get there and then it's like there are no others? Well, for us to be courageous, we need coaching. We do need to have somebody to hold our hand. Let's never be afraid of having somebody that can be a sounding board, that can help me, walk this journey. And this could be a man, could be a woman. There are many women who say that actually helping them to get to the top was a man who became their sponsor. Look for mentorship opportunities and also look for those groups. But sometimes women's groups tend to morph into, very family things or prayer groups and so on. When it's business, then learn to also be in some of these business spaces, because we say that there are rules to the game. So once one is there, learn the rules to the game. Some you may change with time, but initially learn the rules to the game and maybe don't convert it into something that's a bit more, well, maybe I'm stereotyping a lot here, gender and softy, but I'm exaggerating and stereotyping also so that we get the point, because sometimes then it just emphasizes what perhaps we need to balance in the way we behave in some of these spaces. And I think to the men, we could also say to the men, to the older people, to people without certain disabilities, when with others, it's realizing that leadership starts with self-knowledge. I need to know my biases. I need to know some of my prejudices. I need to listen to myself so that I can also appreciate the other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Loach. I appreciate your input. And I'm sure participants are doing the same. I'm now going to go to questions from some of our participants. I'll start with an input and a question from Advocate Vusi Pikoli. This is actually based on your input, Prof Maloka. He says, thank you, Prof Maloka, for raising the dichotomy between national interests, which tend to be narrow and chauvinistic, and continental interests within the framework of Pan-Africanism that we continue paying lip service to. And he continues to say the generation of Nasser, Nkrumah, Kaunda, Nyerere, Lumumba left us the legacy of political independence. They knew that political independence without economic liberation is not meaningful. What is the mission and legacy of this current crop of African leaders, if not economic independence? So I think the question can be around, how do we resolve this tension that you raised? The tension between sovereignty and the expectation to cede the sovereignty if you're going to talk about an integrated, interdependent Africa. At some level, we need to cede our right to take certain sovereign and nationalistic decisions for the greater good. That's the expectation. And also, how do we deal with the very same legacy of the Nkrumahs and we really, really honor them and respect them for the work they've done. But one of the flip sides of that legacy is that current leaders now are a bit reluctant to call each other to account because of, liberation movement, solidarity, and all of those sorts of issues. And that's the reality that we need to confront and talk about. Because if we're going to do a top-down of improving the public service, improving governance, we need to also look at some of these dynamics of how, at party political levels with all over the continent, there's a certain reluctance to really call out certain things because of the relationships that started with our forefathers, Nkrumah, Kaunda, and everybody else. So then back to the core question, the tension, how do we resolve it of what we require at national level and what is required at continental and global level, integration-wise? Thank you, Prof.
No, thank you very much, my sister. I actually don't see a tension. I don't want to sound like I'm advertising my book. I did a study of South African foreign policy and see how these national interests Pan-Africanism, and what I call internationalism. Of course, it's not me coining the word, but the three, how they interact in South African foreign policy, the projection of its influence on the continent, and so on. So I don't see them as a contradiction. The question is, you see, when Nkrumah and the others, they got their independence, Nkrumah, in the constitution of Ghana then, they had made a provision that once a federation is established, Ghana will then enter that federation. There was already a constitutional provision. And Secretari's Guinea also had a similar, but others, they didn't replicate that. And we went our separate ways and created OAU and so on and so on, which was quite a good idea. But the question is that we can't go back to 1960 and undo that. We have to work with what we have today. That's why I'm making an argument that we need to work with the instruments that we have, the Constitutive Act. And the problem we have in the African Union at the moment, we have two base instruments. We have the Constitutive Act, and then we also have the Abuja Treaty. And that we should merge them into one instrument. We should do what the European Unions or the Europeans did with the European Union. As they were generating instruments during the evolution of their union, they got to a stage where they integrated all of them into all the relevant ones into one single instrument. And I think it's something that we need to look at. Currently, we have two base instruments running parallel to each other, running concurrently, and it creates problems. Some organs are established on the basis of Abuja Treaty, others on the basis of the Constitutive Act. Yet they are not the same document, nor are they even complementary, because in the Constitutive Act, in the Abuja Treaty, the African Union is much, much, much later. And whereas with the African Union, the setup is quite different. So I think that we should merge this, have one base instrument and as a foundation. And then when we do that, then we need to go to the issue of how this instrument then you ratify. And I've made the point that the difficulty we have in the AU now, and I know when you were working there as experts, if there's one thing that we fear in the AU, it's an instrument that requires ratification. Because member states can sit in a meeting, agree to an instrument, endorse it, you have a decision, but when it comes to ratification, you don't have appetite. And because of that, then we've been trying to improvise, coming up with the charters, even reducing the number of member states that are required for an instrument to enter into force. But this model or this approach is not working because countries pass these instruments, but they don't act on them. So I think we should take a more courageous route, in my view. We merge these two instruments, come with one instrument, and then on top of it, in this instrument, then we go like the way we did it with the ICC. If countries could do it with the ICC statute, they should be able to do it with the AU or whatever the instrument. That we make provisions for that in that instrument that member states who join this union must then pass national legislation for domesticating the union. At the moment, the union is not domesticated except through political will, through general ratification. We tried the route of ECOSOC chapters, they didn't work. We tried in the foreign ministries, we have focal points, we have this, but it's not working. So we really have to close it, as you say, to try to fuse these two spaces together, the Pan-African continental space with the national space, sovereign space, through a national legislation where the AU commitments now have legal force at country level. We move beyond simply relying on political will and now try to pass a legislation so that AU commitments can also have legal force. But we must also do something. So this legal instrument that I'm talking about, you don't just merge the Abuja Treaty and the Constitutive Act. You also add the treaties of the RECs, the regional economic communities. So we have we could call it the Tower of Babel in the AU. You have Abuja Treaty, you have a Constitutive Act, both are in force. And then at the sub-regional level, in our region, for example, we have SADC Treaty. And SADC Treaty makes commitments. And then SADC Treaty makes commitments that are going well. We say they are all contributing towards the union, but they are independent of the commitments that people make at the level of the AU. And there's been this challenge at the AU level of how do we get the RECs to work together? How do we integrate and try to get the RECs to also to work with the African Union? We tried the protocol route, There is a protocol. We have revised it to try to make it stronger. And we have the so-called what we call the media coordination meetings, where the heads of the RECs, they meet and so on. I'm not sure whether that formula will work, because the problem is that even when you sit in that meeting, you sit in a media meeting, there are decisions taken. When countries get back home, they return to their sovereignty and they do something else. So there is no legal presence of the AU within our member states. And I think it's an issue. So we don't go back to Nkrumah's years and try to ask countries to create in their constitution, to amend their constitution. No, I think that won't send. And you also can't go back and say you must give up your sovereignty. And that's what we're trying to do during the time of our late leader, Colonel Gaddafi, where there was this drive that, let's give up our sovereignty, let's create this union, and so on. And there was a lot of resistance. So, but I think the route we should look at this time is probably coming up with an instrument that brings together the Constitutive Act, the Abuja Treaty, and then collapses the treaties of the RECs into this instrument, and then have this instrument domesticated within countries through a national legislation. But then the RECs, because they are all legal entities, then instead of having treaties, then they have a protocol to this treaty. So you establish the RECs as subsidiary elements to the principal treaty, which will be this treaty. It's a legal approach, but I think it's the way to go. But it's going to be quite difficult because member states have to agree to this. But it's going to be a big challenge because everybody in Africa, if there's one thing you don't want to do, come up with a new instrument. More than that, in fact, even more, get member states to ratify. So that's why people want to go through the declaration, the charters, and avoid the treaties. We see now we have the CFTA treaty. And then, of course, it's now in force. And then our dear brother there is working hard to get more countries to accede. But even with the CFTA treaty, it's going to be, you have ministers of trade. But even with that, you're going to have a challenge because you don't have legal presence within countries. It relies on political will. So instead, I think I'm thinking along those lines that we need to find a more strategic way of situating and locating and entrenching or embedding the AU obligation within member states through legislation. And that's really the route that I want to argue for. And the issues of economic independence, I agree. But how are we doing economic independence? Through the CFTA, I'm not sure. How are we doing economic independence? What mechanism do we have? You see, the challenge we have in Africa is that many of our own countries can't finance their own budgets. Many of our own countries can't finance their own budget. They depend on what they call budget support. So we have to move to the level where we are just the ideas, and now to try to see how do we really get our continent to move forward. And I work for the African Union. The minister is here. One of our biggest problems in the African Union is that we can't finance 100% of our own budget. We have to go to the partners. And the African Union budget is financed by all these member states, but only 5 take the chunk of it: South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Morocco, and Algeria. The others are there because we use the principle of capacity to pay, solidarity and capacity. And these countries are not pretending. It's because they don't have the capacity. So the question of economic independence has to answer the question about the ability, the indigenous ability, endogenous ability or capacity of Africa to pay for its own bill. So we are in a situation at the moment as African people, you go out on a date, you can't pay for your own bill. And it's something that we have to address. And you can see the CFTA, I think it's a good way. We are going in the right direction. But thinking back, I was thinking, we should have really argued, but it's difficult. I wasn't part of that process. That really we need to go towards a situation where we start trying to domesticate AU commitments through national legislation. And the CFTA, even the way we conceptualize it, is independent of other economic programs and other economic programs of the AU. It's independent of NEPAD. It's independent of the financial institution. Each have their own separate. But for me, I think even if you go back to those days when Nkrumah and them were thinking about this, we should look at this as an architecture. The economic, the trade, and of course the infrastructure and all of that. We should see them and try to treat them as an infrastructure and ours as an architecture. We have the African governance architecture agile. So the governance entities we operate as an architecture. We meet, we have a secretariat and so on. The Peace and Security Architecture also operates as an architecture. The Peace and Security Council, Panel of the Wise and so on. But the economic cluster of the AU doesn't operate as a sector. Each operates on its own. Our colleagues in CFT are doing their work, NEPAT is doing its own work, there are other people in PIDA, there are these. So I think we really need to get to a point where we try to get the economic cluster to function as the economic sector of the AU to also to function as an architecture, to try to integrate. And then I think that then we could then be in a much better position to deal with the issues of economic independence. For me, I think that the issue of economic independence today is it's something good, it's something that we aspire for. But I think that we don't have the institutional and the other measures in place to be able to make great strides in the way that we want to go. So I'm sorry I was too long, my sister. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor Oluoch, we've got a question from Patricia Nompumelelo Mhlongo. So I'm posing it to you because you did make you alluded to the concern and the problem of political patronage as being strong and as that potentially impacting on the strength and the supposed independence of the public service. So Patricia says, you really touched on a very sensitive, sorry, what's Patricia's point? You really touched on a very sensitive but good point that is not easy to tackle, that of leaders who are not told when things lose track. Many at times, public servants are to blame for poor service delivery, yet they have an obligation to serve and follow their leader. What can we do about this, Prof? This another tension, possibly.
Another tension where we are clear that, yes, we are all employees. In this case, we are all public servants serving at different levels, where we have people from the lowest cadre to the highest cadre, and many times the feedback to the people, say, in the higher cadres can be very wanting or limited in terms of that truth about how we are doing and how indeed what we are seeing here in terms of the figures, I think, coming on our screen as to how much Africa loses every year. I think it speaks to a question or a point that was raised by Prof, where we're saying that we need to be ruthless in terms of how honest we want to be and the actions we are willing to take when some of these unfortunate, and especially be it corrupt or be it just behavioral shortfalls are identified in our leaders. Because starting from leadership styles and the feeling of, the big man syndrome, perhaps also there's a big lady syndrome, where a person wants to lead in a certain way that makes them dominate over, over others. Because I think traditionally people brought to the workplace probably a certain image of a technocrat or of a serious business person or a serious government official, which perhaps was devoid of a bit of humanity. So I would say that this feedback issue is important, but I think one of the ways in which we can work on it is to, again, emphasize the fact that we all come to the workplace as a whole human being, meaning with our mind, with our hearts, with our hands, and therefore, being a whole human being, there is possibility to interact. I think Professor was saying, public servants are not just hands, they think. And therefore, if everybody always agrees with you, they don't give you, feedback, or ideas always seem to, your ideas and your suggestions or your direction is never challenged. There's never really a discussion around it, or it's in such a way that is a bit flat, then there is a problem. Now, when it's something serious which needs to be corrected, then it is likely to be even less. So I would say, Patricia, one of the ways we can begin to try and change this is to appreciate and to help ourselves wherever we are, whatever level of the organizations we are at this moment, and as we grow, that we are human beings. We need communication, we need dialogue, And bringing that human person then demystifies this individual who cannot be told. Yes, personalities are different. The ways in which we approach leadership or the cultures we build within our organizations in order to have spaces where we can speak to each other, we can speak to issues, is very important. But I think I have been in the public service for about 6 years now, and I found it very, very hierarchical. Whereas sometimes, with that kind of deference, which is important given to seniors, it's like you're not supposed to speak. You don't open your mind. But this is just a human being like me. I will not lose respect by being human, even having humor, seeing people when I arrive there, greeting them in the morning. And when there's something to say, then also just naturally as a human being, being able to say so. So I think I see it very clearly as anchored in this whole issue of who are these people? Who are these leaders? Are we seeing each other as human beings working with fellow human beings? And therefore the feedback mechanism could be a culture that could be built starting from that recognition and appreciation. We are all servants just serving in our various roles. And therefore, as we think about some more concrete areas, I would say the whole area, at least in Kenya now, what we are trying to build is the reality of mainstreaming coaching as an intervention, as a way of also helping our leaders to get feedback that helps them to develop, first of all, as leaders, but also in some of these other areas in terms of either financial management or procurement issues or other aspects. But then coaching as one of the interventions other than training that becomes mainstream in the public service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Very insightful answer. I'm looking at the time, and I'm wondering if I should pose to you your final reflections. So at least you've got 5 minutes each for those, because we've got the Honorable Minister who's supposed to speak in exactly 15 minutes. So I would not want to have an overrun on the program. What I wanted to find out from you, and this is a point that also came through in different ways from some of the participants, including your own input, to say, we are now in a COVID and hopefully we'll be in a post-COVID world that has impacted the way generally everybody does business, governments, private sector, everybody, civil society, even the way society organizes itself. So that then says we need to redefine and we need to reimagine our public service. The normal way of business has to change, and that's going to impact, the systems that we use, the ways that we think, the kind of, you spoke about ideology, Professor Maloka, the kind of ideological underpinnings we need to have for solutions that we need for the citizenry. Now, I need to ask you for your reflections of, if you had to reimagine and redefine a public service or a public servant for your country or for the continent, what would that look like? From both your perspectives, what would that look like? So we are reimagining now, who we're going to hire, who we're going to have drive all these programs that you're all working on and that you're all supporting. What would that system and that individual look like? Prof. Maluk.
That's a very difficult question, really, my sister, because it's really a question about, it goes back to what I think Professor Lucho raised earlier in our discussion. When you are looking at public servants, I think we should look for leaders. So if you are looking for leaders, then as you recruit, you must recruit those that you think are already leaders and those that have the potential to be leaders. And then to be a leader, it doesn't mean, of course, it's good leading a march and protesting in front. That's an element of it. But really, leadership for me is about innovation. And the public servants or the civil service, they are at the coalface of implementation of government policies. And you need people who are innovators. If you can find a solution, what is it that you need to do? And I don't want to go back to the Chinese model, because I had the opportunity to visit different parts, and what impressed me with what they were doing and how they were able to get so much out of their civil service is innovation. So they put you there, they put in an area, and you have to innovate. You are a local leader there, you have to innovate. You have to find solutions to the problems. If you are in an area, there is unemployment, there is shortage of water, there is this, you don't look up and start writing memo after memo it's part of it, but you must yourself there find a solution locally. What is it that you know, what creative ways, what are the things? So I think the issue for me, you need leaders, you need to recruit, you need to build leaders. And leadership across the system. Then public servants should see themselves as leaders. They are leaders, they are not just there sitting and pushing paper, but they are leaders, they are playing an important role. But the key element of that has to be the fourth thing, has to be the innovation, the question of innovation, finding solutions, the creative solutions to problem, not going back and sending memos to ask other people to solve problems for you. And as part of that, you also don't want wheelbarrows. So your leaders must be self-driven, self-motivated. It's people, when you live there, you know, you come back 10 days later, the person is no longer there. It's already in another room, and you are looking, say, oh, you are there. Yes, I thought I should come here. This is what and then already that person is giving you. So I think that's really what you need, leaders. The second thing, of course, the issues of technology are very clear. Perhaps we had not emphasized enough the issue of technology in how getting institutions, how you get. Myself, I never used to use Zoom and Teams. I believe before COVID, I used to believe we had Teams in the office. I didn't know even what it is, but I believed in physical meetings, going to missions, going to this meeting directly countries. But now I've realized that actually you don't need many of that. You can do a lot of things on Teams. You can do a lot of things on Zoom. I think the technology element is going to be very key in this reimagined civil service. But the technology element is what it presents for us. It presents a new challenge. It needs people who are self-motivated, people who are self-disciplined. There is a tendency now that has happened in the past. You know, we used to talk about civil servants coming to the office and put the jacket in your office and then hang it there on the chair and disappear, go and sit with your friends elsewhere. But there's a new tendency now with the Zoom. People switch in and log in. You can see Eddie Maloka is logged in, but I'm actually not in that meeting. I'm sitting, I'm doing some other things. I'm just sitting there and so on. So it's a problem, and we are dealing with it now where there's some sort of absenteeism, technology-driven absenteeism of people being there and logged in, but actually, and people don't work when they are working away from home. They don't work because they are not motivated. They need a driver, they need a leader, they need a manager who's telling them what to do, and so on. So for me, those two elements will be very key. The issue of leadership, but leadership meaning innovation. You don't need the wheelbarrows, you need people who are self-motivated. And the second issue is the technology component. You had asked me a question that I forgot, and I'm going to be very brief about leaders giving feedback to each other. Really, that's what we do in the APRM. The APRM was conceived for that, for leaders to give feedback to each other, to correct each other. But over time, of course, it became a bit more formal. And now the presidents have agreed now that we need to review and strengthen and improve how we give feedback to each other, become more robust. So from next year, and then South Africa is lucky because this is happening under the chairship of President Ramaphosa and of course the Honorable Minister who speaks soon, that there's this innovation now in the APRM that leaders should be more robust and so on. So we are trying to introduce new measures to ensure that leaders are more direct, more helpful to each other, but also to us to also think of more creative ways of getting countries to implement the recommendation, because APRM reviews generate recommendations, but you find that there is political will to implement this recommendation, but there is no capacity. So we now have to look at innovative ways of how to address this. Capacities can be institutional, but it's also fiscal. So we're looking at that, and really, Madam, since this is my last opportunity to talk, to really thank you and thank Busani for really inviting me, waking me up so early in West Africa. I was up and seated here at 6:30 in the morning, and to say this has been a privilege and opportunity, and also to thank the Honorable Minister and my dear sister, of course, there in Mombasa, wherever you are enjoying yourself. It was really lively, and I learned a lot from this exchange. And yourself, my dear sister, if your mom was my teacher, please, I must say I'm very grateful to your family for what you did to a lot of us who were taught by Mrs. Matabuche. Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. The sentiment will certainly be communicated to the family. Professor Oluoch, same question to you. A redefined, reimagined public service or public servant. What would that look like in your world?
Okay, I think the backdrop, as you asked it the first time, is also the reality of COVID-19 having somehow disrupted the normal that we knew. And I would say in reimagining the public servant of the future, yes, from the standpoint of those who are already in that flexibility to be able to allow for different kinds of options in terms of work situations, remote working, working at their place, and above all, therefore, a public servant that is able to manage themselves, because this also requires a lot of self-discipline and that requires a lot of accountability. So when we talk about just dovetailing from what Prof has said in terms of the leaders, bringing in leaders, I'd want to say that yes, leadership can be trained. Some of these trained or grown and nurtured, because providing or unleashing the potential of the public servant of the future is very important for us. Yes, people should be able to work in different spaces. People should be able to contribute in different ways and be creative. I imagine a public service that allows for that kind of creativity, and a public service that is ready to nurture and to grow people to be able to be diverse, to appreciate that diversity is actually a strength. It has challenges in terms of managing or in terms of overcoming barriers or in terms of overcoming prejudices, but then diversity training is also important for public servants, just for us to be able to appreciate that indeed there are differences, but those differences can indeed be the beginning of wonderful, wonderful creativity among us. Because just because we are different doesn't mean that therefore we are stuck in a certain box. This creativity, this innovation comes as a consequence of having and appreciating and acknowledging the diversity that is within us. We also need a lot more. I would say the public service of the future, I imagine one where we can improve on communication and conflict resolution skills, because I think at the bottom of this feedback to our leaders, feedback to the people who report to us, feedback horizontally and vertically, is the whole issue of good communication, candid conversations that build on one another. And these are things that I think can indeed be supported by interventions such as mentoring, such as coaching, and just that greater honesty. It can sound rather, I remember somebody telling me not too long ago that it sounds so idealistic. And I say, well, what will we do without ideals? We must have an ideal. Yes, there is the actual situation, but we must have the ideal towards which we want to go. Without those ideals, as was also painted at the beginning, then what are we, or what will we be living for? So I think that public service of the future, I see it with greater knowledge, greater skills, but maybe better attitudes in terms of seeking integration with human beings working with fellow human beings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, professors. We've come to the end of the interaction with yourselves, getting ready for the input by the minister. But thank you so much for all that you've shared with us today. Is quite helpful. I was reminded now when you were both responding to this last question of the type of public servant that we should have for the future, and the fact that both of you are emphasizing on the fact that we need leaders as public servants. It reminded me of a response. Those of you that are familiar with the gospel group Joyous Celebration, it's quite popular actually, even on the continent. One of the founders was asked, how do you put together such a prolific choir, as it were? And his answer was that I don't look for choristers and I don't look just for singers. I look for soloists that are put together to form a choir. So I think what I hear from you is that even in the public servant, we should already look for the leader and not just look for a worker who will eventually become a leader, but find a conglomeration of leaders and put them together and have an ecosystem of an efficient public service. So thank you so much. I think it's been quite insightful for everybody that has been following. Certainly for me, I really appreciate how candid both of you have been in sharing your thoughts. So without further ado, I will move straight into our next session, where we will be hearing from the Honorable Minister of Public Service and Administration for the Republic of South Africa, Honorable Senzo Mchunu, who is a long-serving member of Parliament, a former Premier of the KwaZulu-Natal province, and all-round passionate servant leader. Minister Mchunu will do the honors of concluding what has been a wonderful, actually a whole entire week of events that have been commemorating Africa Public Service Day. So South Africa took the initiative to have a series of conversations and events, and this is the last one. So we've got the honor of closing the week, and the minister will give us closing remarks. Minister, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mataboge. I've been following the proceedings up to now, and I think you're a wonderful program director. Thank you very much for that. My greetings to the CEO of our APRM at Maluka, and thanks for your wonderful presentation this morning. It all was very educative for all of us who were following the program this morning. My sister in Kenya, Ms. Priska Oluk, who is the director of the school there, national school there. Thank you very much. Wonderful to hear from you from East Africa this morning. Quite sterling indeed. And then principal of the National School of Government in South Africa, Mr. Ngaweni, and all the public servants that may happen to have an opportunity to follow the program this morning here and all of the continent, and guests. Now, once more, I must round off the salutations by acknowledging today's interaction. It was really very educative on public service as a whole. Now, the Union of, the African Union member states, our Republic of South Africa and others, of course, all of us as a collective, we celebrate Africa Day, Public Service Africa Day every year, but once in 2 years in the form of a conference like we had this week, which was quite an eye-opener and very beneficial indeed to have had the opportunity to attend it. We also were acknowledging that we were celebrating this in the continent at the backdrop of the United Nations' own recognition efforts of public service throughout the world, and acknowledging the contribution by public servants. And the two collaborate in terms of focusing the whole world and society as such in the importance of public service. And it was indeed an opportune time for us to ensure that we lift the lead on public service and put it on the spotlight and its role as a whole. This year, the theme, as you would know, ladies and gentlemen, it was building the Africa we want through embracing an ethical a culture that underpins purpose-driven leadership in the context of a crisis. Indeed, we have had a crisis and we're still going through this pandemic, COVID-19, throughout the world and our continent, particularly in South Africa, and it's intensifying and we're worried about it. But yet we have to focus part of our attention on the resilience of our system, basically the public service, and rely on it in terms of harnessing all the bridges that will allow us to cross over to a period post COVID-19 pandemic. We have to sustain this. We have to keep it servicing our people, but even making progress in the face of crisis. We don't have to look down and cry and say we'll wait until it goes before we make progress that we otherwise intended to do, because there's not the Africa we want. The Africa we want is the one that is able to cross swelling rivers, one that is able to cross steep mountains, one that is able to withstand any weather, even floods. That is the kind of public service that we require, that will indeed be able to make us realize our Agenda 2063. If it gets taken by every storm that comes, any wind that blows, and it doesn't have the resilience of going up the mountains and so on, it will take a long time before we realize our dreams. So this year's Africa Public Service main event was in Zimbabwe, in Victoria Falls. And indeed, we had quite a very fruitful interaction with the whole of the continent under the theme celebrating the courage and resilience of public servants in the management of COVID-19, very focused. But then another theme was embracing cultural diversity as a level to strengthen institutions for a responsive and ethical public administration. So the conversation here about cultural diversity and how it contributes to public service, even make it vibrant and appealing to all the citizens of the country, was very much in consonant with what we discussed in Zimbabwe in terms of acknowledging the role of cultural diversity. Now, deploying technology to sustain and enhance service delivery in the face of the challenging COVID-19 climate, a pandemic climate, that was another theme. Very long and dynamic interactions that we had about our technology and how we need to take advantage of YR and make full use of it within public administration and to improve it and even move it to higher heights. And the last theme was achieving inclusivity that fosters capacity for effective and efficient service delivery. Now, the continental event was successful by and large in getting us closer as a continent to the Africa we want, the Africa that we're imagining, and the Africa that takes to higher heights the dream that the forefathers of our Pan-Africanism in the continent imagined. Kwame Nkrumah, among others, Mandela, KK, Julius Nyerere, to name but a few, are among the stalwarts in our continent, our icons, who went on to be international icons in their own right, who made us imagine the Africa that we want, which we are still dreaming about. To an extent, we have achieved some of their dreams, some of their aspirations, but to another extent, there have been setbacks. And we are still a very long way before we achieve what we should, in some cases, have achieved by now. And so the question is, at the end of the day, what do our administrations do? This takes us to Agenda 2063 of the Africa we want. So one of the key issues that we discussed there was how do we link public service management with the imperative of development? How do we afford this imagination as one, that public service must at any given time give meaning to all the citizens of the country and the citizens of the continent in the aspect of economic development, so that it's not administration for the sake of administration and for the sake of today and for the sake of little things, important as they may be, like your IDs, your birth certificates, and all the other things that are helpful in an administration. But at the end of the day, there are higher goals. There are more important goals than everyday administration and what it does and what it achieves for people. It's around economic development. It's around those programs that sustain life and improve it even. And therefore, Agenda 2063 comes into play. And therefore, it's important that we continue linking public administration to development and economic development in particular. Now, both good public administration and economic development depend on good governance, which in turn depends on how good your public administration is. Now, good governance is as good as governance. Any governance must include good governance. It can't be governance unless it's embedded on good governance. I could imagine all the guerrillas in our liberation armies and liberation movements, when all of us were in Bush, whether in East Africa, West Africa, the center, north, south, we were imagining that one day we'll overcome and overthrow colonialists, in our case, the apartheid architects, and then flourish. We're full of that aspiration, which itself was inspired by our liberation movements being able to carry the aspirations of the larger populations. And therefore, we're imagining that once the time came for us to be in government, we will then flourish and ensure that good governance, good administration will then translate into better lives for all our people, free of greed and corruption and the like. So it's difficult to imagine 2063 without fighting against corruption, even to a point where we must accept that there will have to be casualties as we move on in this fight. It's difficult to imagine that presidents are not going to be focusing on this, on rooting out corruption, and you can't, and the fact that they can't use soft handedness on this matter. They can't put their hands in gloves and be able to and hope to eliminate corruption. This thing called corruption is a disease that gets far deep into people and their networks, and therefore it requires quite a hard attitude, and in some cases hard handling. You can't persuade people to leave corruption. Action has to be immediate. Action has to be hard. Action has to be confrontational. Action has to be sustained if we are to eliminate it. It is just like colonialism, because colonialism was magnified corruption in the form of imperialism from original states and so on over other people. It was inspired by greed and so on. And therefore, that's why they took with them not only the Bible, they took arms with them, firearms, soldiers, to ensure that their mission would succeed. Now, when you want to reverse this, when you want to fight corruption, it's imperative that you are not going to depend on soft instruments. It's not going to work. I'm clear about that. It's not going to work. Instead, it will breed just under the noses of our regimes and our presidents. And 2016 is around 2063 is around the corner, and we won't have achieved anything except just a dream that one day Africa will be able to move and realize in full the imagination of our giant leaders that are forefathers of the continent of Africa. So what then must these administrations achieve? I just want to say that while Agenda 2063 is good on paper and so on, I think we need to start thinking in a much more organized way, like putting this agenda on phases. Where must we be in 2030, in 2040, in 2050? Make it phases, each phase with a specific objective and with specific or supported by specific activities and coordination in a coordinated approach in terms of implementing it. And monitoring and evaluation what we shall have achieved and are seeking to achieve in the immediate, medium, and so on going forward. And sitting from time to time to say, are we making progress? Whether we do it via protocols or some legal instruments or some other mechanisms is another matter. That must be decided once and for all if we are to achieve anything. Forcing administrations to take a particular shape that will ensure that we are able to achieve the goals of this agenda. Now, if we don't do that, if we don't specify, it will be a problem. I hear what Professor Maluka is arguing, that we need a much more concretized legal framework. But I just want to add that much as we may need to evaluate that, we need to take from the experience of the past as well, where merely by persuasion, the power of merit of thought, the power of being able to take people to imagine and get forced by that imagination into the future is also a very powerful powerful instrument. As Africans, we much as the authority is needed of one kind or the other, but we are people of goodwill. We are people of imagination. We imagined our freedoms, our liberation. And as people like Nyerere, KK, and others, including Angolans, focused on liberating even South Africa as the last post of post-colonialism in the form of apartheid, there was no legal instrument that forced them to collaborate with the liberation armies of South Africa. They use their consciences. They they used the imagination of the benefits of freedom and liberation, and they voluntarily volunteered, even they volunteering their resources in the fight against apartheid in the case of South Africa and Namibia, and did so gradually as we attained our freedoms. So that's our culture in the continent. That's the way we work in the continent. And so while we may embrace other new instruments, but we do have our old instruments, and we need to combine all of these and move. We have the APRM, it's a volunteer instrument or mechanism that we freely embraced, and we join it country after country, and it's working, it's going to bear fruit. But of course, I'm saying we need a combination of those two on our way to achieving our goals in terms of the Agenda 2063. So this is our blueprint in transforming our continent. Of course, extensive deliberations were gone into in Zimbabwe, and we're looking forward to making progress in this regard. The issue of ethics and fighting corruption in the continent is a compelling one, especially if we look back and of what has happened in the name of public service in our continent. Recently, we've seen how people took advantage of distribution of PPEs, vaccines, and every other thing on COVID-19 to enrich themselves and budget their stomachs in the process. We seem to be rolling from one scandal to the next. And therefore, we need to accept that we start from a low level of ethics and ethics directives and issues of integrity. We start from a low level, and therefore you need a lot of interventions to enforce ethics. I was looking yesterday at one social media thing announcing that one MSc in one province is using a car hired at 90,000 a month, and he doesn't see anything wrong with that. Now, at a period where we're yearning to use every cent maximally for the benefit against COVID-19 and to advance public service, whether it's education or health and other things. And then people never forget to budget themselves and start hiring cars at 90,000 a month. Instead of using their salaries to buy their cars, they just want to flow above others in that fashion. And there's no doubt that that's unethical. There's no doubt that there's no integrity in doing that. And it borders on corruption, even if it's done procedurally. And therefore, we need to embrace this broad meaning within which consciousness needs to be developed that embrace issues of high ethics and high integrity imperatives, and then fight corruption. Of course, in the continent, the more than 88 billion rand outflow of revenue from the continent is a sore point. It runs directly against the aspirations of our continent and Agenda 2063. And it means that as long as it goes on like that, it would mean that our public administration as a continent and as various countries still has leaks. It allows leaks, and it borders on unaccountability on the side of different governments. And therefore, we have to pay attention on that. This is a resource that should be used for the benefit of the continent and development and economic development of the continent, and to allow it to be stolen right under our noses by foreign people and some people internally who are keen on benefiting from taking this, playing an active role in these outflows. And therefore, our broader fight against corruption will include definitely, and has to include even our activities around Agenda 2063, observation that that outflow, revenue outflow, is an enemy of the people of the continent, together with poverty and other sins that are being committed at the moment, and other attacks against our people. And therefore, we have to march together. So all in all is to say, what overall does public administration, that is public service, in this country, that country seeks to achieve overall, apart from what day-to-day activities in this and that department, in government, cabinet after cabinet meeting, overall, when the end, where the year ends, what have we achieved overall? That becomes something to be spoken about, because there's no one who is going to clap hands saying ministers took flights up and down this and that province, in and out of the country, and say that is what public service entails. Certainly, it's much more concrete things that we have to calculate over and above the day-to-day activities, and we have to imagine those. Of course, celebrating our public servants who are paying tribute to them and acknowledging their role throughout the continent, throughout the world, and also in our country, as we do now, as we close this celebration of recognition of public servants within public service as a whole. And may they feel recognized as we make more and more efforts. Even the head of state, our President Ramaphosa, on a number of occasions, on a number of platforms, has clearly come out to celebrate the achievements of public servants, resilience of public service, and putting the public servant right at the center of what we're doing. And therefore, may they be blessed, may they be, may they feel much more fulfilled that their sacrifice, while they are public servants, but in their own right, sacrifice beyond the call of duty, one by one, in their different stations of work, in different categories of public service, whether it is health, security, or in education, or correctional services, and any other, home affairs, and all the areas of work. The cleaners, the guards that are in public service, all of them are celebrated. And we thank them on this particular day as we close these celebrations. Indeed, they are important. But of course, we have to also pay tribute to upper echelons of leadership of public service, the DGs, the DDGs, chief directors, and so on. We will never stop pushing them in terms of having to do more on innovation, do more on productivity, do more on managing resources of the state with a heightened consciousness that it must, at the end of the day, these resources must help lift someone on a daily basis who is otherwise stuck. The movement of our people via migration to seek greener pastures in the, even to the extent of risking their lives to cross the seas on dangerous boats and so on, is a reflection of the state of our public services, the impact that our public service is not yet making. It's hunger, it is poverty broadly, but it is also conflict. And therefore, if our public service in the continent does not reverse the impact of such conflict, causes of that conflict, does not reverse causes of such movement, and therefore causes of poverty, we can't rest. And therefore we can't call for any cooling on the side of management, upper echelons of management in this country and elsewhere in the continent, because we are still being called upon to get to the root causes of these major social phenomena that are causing such havoc. You know, you sit here, you imagine every day when we get the news of 30 people, 300 people sinking into the high seas in search of greener pastures. And it goes down and it passes the statistics. But when you go down to the names of those people, their surnames, their loved ones, the children they were carrying in their bags in some cases, the villages where they come from, the devastation and the pain that it causes, you really come down to reflect and wonder whether public administration is making any impact or how much of it it is making in terms of transforming all those and reversing all those problems, so that life becomes normal to everybody else. In our country, we still have to make impact for the poor ones. There is a lot of clamor for cities and urban areas at the moment in the form of a migration from rural to centers. It isn't in search of electricity as it would have been 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Most of the villages are now lighted, even though there's from time to time this thing called load shedding. So it's more of a survival, search for survival means whenever people move from rural to urban areas. They are no longer searching just for a hot bath in a shower, hot shower, or something like that. They are looking for jobs. They are looking for meaningful economic activities that they can take advantage of, given their own capacity. And therefore, our administration as a whole, public administration, public service as a whole, still need to look at how do we mitigate, how do we intervene and reverse all those particular problems. Unemployment that is growing in leaps and bounds, reaching 32.6%, is also a reflection that our public service still need to get to the bottom of that and correct them. And there's still a lot in our public service that says that not all is synergized and channeled towards serious thinking in terms of making progress. We have to liaise with our work together with the private sector on COVID, on the fight against COVID-19, but also in advancing public services going forward, and be very accountable. So DGs, all of us, we need to go even up to this extension that our school, National School of Government, needs to commit and even commit much more, more and more on ensuring that we inculcate this, that we deepen morality, ethics, and integrity, but also higher goals of ensuring that there isn't to be public service for the sake of it, while we are just in suits and cars and so on, and in high places, briefing each other and delivering paper after paper. It all has to translate into tangible benefits for people who are vulnerable and are much more in need of public services to uplift their lives. And that is our primary measurement if we are to be proud of public service at all. It's not even about salaries. And I do note that at the moment, public service, especially in South Africa, is still characterized by antagonism. Even when you put a topic, you can tell by the nature of the input that this person comes from this aspect of public service. It's a much more we and them, perpetual finger pointing, and less in terms of contributing on thoughts that could take us forward. And it's much more on and it becomes much sharper on salaries and so on, and partly because for a long time we have let ourselves down in terms of creating systems and dependent on other instruments to deal with this aspect of public administration. It will never, otherwise the employer-employee dynamic will never stop. But if we are to make advance and progress in this country and elsewhere, we need to be in search of systems and mechanisms that will stabilize public service in the country, and then pay attention to more strategic things, shifting to that, while also paying attention to conditions of work, as it were. As I sit down, I want to appreciate this masterclass, particularly thanking the School of Government in South Africa. I want to emphasize the instruction of government to the principal and his team that we are on a mission to reposition the school. We're on a mission wherein we want to see the school playing a much more elaborate but qualitative intervention where such intervention is most needed in order to reshape our public service by way of training, by way of education, by way of conscientizing, and by way of ensuring that public service is much more productive and innovative with less resources, of course, but overall also checking practical impact of what we are doing generally in public service, but also in terms of training. And I agree with them that a lot of impact will be done via partnerships, both in the private and public sector across the globe. And then we move on to achieve our Agenda 2063 with public service playing a very, very important and decisive role towards that. With that, I thank you very much once more, Ms. Mataboge, and all your team for having hosted us so beautifully in this morning before we go celebrate Friday amid COVID, and be happy in the evenings for whatever we'll be doing, but with our masks tight against our noses and mouths, without anyone observing and supervising us. You do this as an individual for the sake of yourself and the family and the family of South Africans as a whole. Distancing, clean hands, all in all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Really, I think there's no greater ending than the call that we all need to remember as public servants, where you said it all has to translate to results for the most vulnerable among us. I think if we keep that at the heart of what we do, not just as South Africa, but the broader African public service, we really will transform this continent. So thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your remarks. I will now hand over to our host, the one who invited us here, the principal of the National School of Government of the Republic of South Africa, Professor Busani Naweni. I'll hand over to the principal for closing remarks and vote of thanks. So as a result, you won't hear from me again. So I'll take this opportunity to say thank you very much for affording me the opportunity to be the facilitator and for bearing with me. It's been quite my honor. I am Lerato Mataboke and I remain appreciative. Professor Naweni, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director Lerato. I really do appreciate the fact that you graciously agreed to be part of this session today and for diligently steering the ship. It's been very fruitful engagement with the intervention by Professor Maloka. Thank you for that animated intervention that you made, Prof. It's good that you could make time to be available even as we are somewhere in West Africa. In fact, I must also say it's very interesting how the minister has been able to intervene and even give us favors with feedback of the interaction that the Honorable Minister has had with his counterparts in Zimbabwe earlier this week, and there is actually a good synergy between the outcome of the meeting the minister is referring to, plus the intervention that was made by Prof. Maloka in his capacity as CEO of the APRM. I must say, it's actually very interesting, Prof. Maloka, that as you are making your intervention and I've followed your work, people don't complain that you are speaking as a South African. That's how, multinational diplomats, interact, so that people don't think that you are just here speaking about, the country from where you originate. We thank you for that. We also thank my sister, Priscilla. I sent her a message and I said, me and you owe each other some interactions. Please, if you can be available and come and be the respondent. And she was very, gracious in agreeing to come and be here. And Priscilla, me and you mustn't only meet in Beijing. We need to meet locally as well. We must make the arrangement. And we thank the School of Government for allowing you to be here. But this would not have been possible, colleagues, had it not been for the network of schools of government in Africa, UMDIN. So we must thank them for making an arrangement, for making this possible. It wasn't just an occasion of the National School of Government in South Africa. We are just the host, but a network of schools of government in the continent are the ones who pulled together this program, and we really appreciate that. And that facility, of course, is supported and sponsored by the EU. And that is why you see the EU logo in the document that you see on top right. So in the network of schools of government in the continent led by President Tulondo, we are supported by the EU in the work we do. There's great work ahead. There's a big qualification that we are finalizing, working with our counterparts in UMDIN. And hopefully by the end of this year, we will have a consortium of universities that are going to be supporting this this program that we are working on, so that come 2023, we'll have a new qualification that will be started on African governance. And I must tell you, both Eddie and Priscilla, in fact, even the issues raised by the minister, that the qualification that we are working on will incorporate all the elements that you have spoken about, so that we train a new cadre of public servants in the continent. So thank you once again for being here. We thank the colleagues. In fact, maybe they must show their videos if they can. There was translation taking place here, both in French and in Portuguese. If the translators, if they're here, they can show their videos. We must appreciate their work, because they are colleagues who've been able to follow us here from Mozambique, Angola, and somewhere in West Africa, because of the translators who are here. If the interpreters if they can just show their faces, because they do a very important work and we hardly ever acknowledge them. There they are on top. Thank you very much to all of you for supporting this, because without your being here, there might be colleagues who may not have been able to follow this work. In fact, as I'm doing, we have there's a journal that we're supporting as the NSG. It comes out in both Portuguese, French, as well as in English. And it is an important thing to acknowledge, because this work has to be international in the manner in which it is being carried out. So we do thank Eva and all the other colleagues. Otherwise, colleagues, lastly, I thank all of you for participating here. We hope you learned. We have a link. We will share the link here if you want to go back to some of the interventions that have been made. Certainly, Prof. Maloka, this was a masterclass. And so we will be using this material as when we are interacting with public servants in our respective countries. And we thank you for that. And we thank the colleagues at DPSA. There is a secretariat that organizes all of this work every year, the Africa Public Service Week, and the recommendations. And in this regard, they asked the National School of Government to host this as part of closing. But the colleagues at DPSA, led by this acting DG, I think I saw him here today himself. He can open his video. In fact, everyone who's able to open a video, if you can please all open your videos so that we take a group photo with everyone who is a panelist. I think you all have the right to share your videos. So we take a group photo. Advocate Bikoli, hello. Good to see you. Hello, yeah, everyone. So we take a group photo. There are colleagues who are supporting us technically. Zugo, Madi, we acknowledge that we were able to keep this thing going throughout. Pumla, Soraya, where the colleagues from DPSA, I don't see them. These are the colleagues who made sure that we are fully connected today. We must thank them, otherwise we could have a lot of technical glitches with these things and you end up not having a good run. So thank you, colleagues. As the minister said, let's be safe this weekend, but do enjoy. We will meet again when we organize another session, same time next year. When we do the one of the country in September, we will do another session. We will certainly invite all of you. Thank you once again. Have a great afternoon further. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.